welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. I'm your host, Eric Bjornstad, your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. The Fuel Pulse Show podcast is for anyone who uses fuel or who has things that use fuel, whether at work or at home, which means it's pretty much for everyone, especially those who, in their professional capacity, may mean taking care of fuel because they need to use it to get the job done, whatever that job may be. So if you think any of that sounds a little bit like you, then this podcast is for you. So what are we talking about today? Well, today we wanted to do things a little bit different. Most of our episodes involve interviews and discussions with other professionals in the fuels industry. Could be fuel service professionals, hospital administrators, operations managers, fleet managers, people like that, people who can talk about what's happening in their particular sphere of influence and hopefully pass along some interesting information to people in the audience who may not have known that thing before. I myself, I am the technical director for Bell Performance. Our primary business is in the formulations industry. We formulate problem-solving solutions for petroleum fuels. And in my position as the technical director, which I've been in for the good part of 15 years now, I do get asked a lot of questions. And there are some questions that are asked more often than others. So today, we're going to consider one of these questions, and that is, how do you know what is a good fuel treatment? How can you tell a good fuel treatment from one that's not so good? So there's a lot to be said about this. So let's get started. So how to choose a good fuel treatment? This question is a little more challenging, a little maybe less straightforward than some others. Or perhaps you could say it's more of an art than a science. I think that's because when you're trying to answer questions like this, you cannot really control the information that you have access to. You really have to work with what you've got, so to speak. And if you are a layperson who is unfamiliar with the industry, then you shouldn't be expected to know the answers to the kinds of questions you need to ask in order to answer this. I mean, these questions, this issue is hard enough to answer if you are in the industry, but fuels professionals, hospital administrators, fleet managers, people like that, they're professionals who have jobs that require them to be experts in other things. They're not petroleum chemists, and they shouldn't be expected to have to figure these kinds of things out for themselves. And I think that's unfortunately, what some in the industry rely on, this kind of inevitable marketplace confusion. I mean, let's face it, there is a lot of confusion out there, and there are a lot of people who are kind of raising their hands in response to this, saying, no, hey, we're the best. No, we're the best. No, we're the best. I mean, how many of you out there have seen that kind of situation where, let's say you are a fleet manager, or even better, a hospital administrator who's facing an upcoming Joint Commission audit. One thing that's rolled into the the all-encompassing Joint Commission audits are the requirements that hospitals and healthcare facilities have to have stored backup fuel of a certain amount, and it has to be maintained in a certain condition. There has to be, paperwork and testing proof, things like that. They have to keep all of that on track, and it's really a comprehensive kind of thing. So I am facing a Joint Commission audit. It's upcoming, and so I start thinking about my fuel. And I know enough about fuel and about fuel issues to entertain the idea that I might need to treat my fuel with something to solve a problem that I think is going to impact my facility on this Joint Commission audit. So I start looking around for a fuel additive. What do I find when I start looking around? I get inundated with like 20 different kinds, and all of these are doing the same thing. And funny enough, they're all claiming to be the best thing since sliced bread, so to speak. How can I be expected to know which one of these is actually the best? I mean, I am a hospital administrator. I am not a petroleum chemist. I am not a fuel expert. How can I be expected to sift through the information? Heck, how do I know what kind of information I should sift through in order to make the best decision for me and my position? I mean, in the end, you don't know what you don't know. So, does any of that sound like the experiences of anyone else out there? So yeah, this question is not the easiest one to answer, but we are going to take our best crack at it. So when I'm explaining or trying to answer this kind of question to people, I focus on three things to look for. How do I know what a good fuel additive is? I look at three things. Okay, so concept number one, point number one. First thing I look at is this concept that the more it promises to do, the less likely it is that it will deliver on everything that it promises. Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. Um, you have you're considering a product, right? You have this product here. Now, you don't know anything about this. All you know is what it is telling you it's going to do for you. You don't know what's actually in the formulation. Really, none of us knows what's in the formulation for that particular thing. And so, short of knowing exactly what's in it, we have to make inferences from the information that the information that we think is credible and that we have access to. So, when I look at this, I take the viewpoint that if it claims to do something, and what I mean is if it's claiming to accomplish a specific kind of function, then it should actually contain ingredients that help it do that, right? I mean, that uh, that seems self evident, right? So if it's claiming to do something, it's got to contain something in the formulation that's going to help it do that particular thing. So the question is, how can we know if it does contain that kind of ingredient? And this is where you have a lot of subtlety and a lot of nuance that comes into it, because it's not like you can just call up the manufacturer and say, hey, does your formulation really contain detergent? That's not really an option to get information that way. You can't just call the manufacturer. And the people that do actually have that kind of information, like the EPA, well, they're not going to tell you, and they shouldn't tell you, because in case you didn't know, one of the requirements for at least for on-road fuel additives are that their formulations have to be registered with the EPA. This is partly a consumer protection issue and partly an environmental issue when it comes down to it. The EPA requires you, in order to sell a fuel additive that's going to go into on-road fuel, the EPA requires you to register your formulation with it. So you have to tell them what's in it. And then they can tell pretty easily if it's got something in it that's not supposed to be there. And if it does, they'll kick it back to you and they'll tell you that it has to be changed. But the EPA has that information. And they actually have a web page. I forget the exact location for the exact URL, but if you were to Google registered let's say registered diesel fuel additives EPA, you will find the list of all of the legally registered fuel additives for diesel fuel. There's another list for gasoline. And one thing you can do if you're doing due diligence is you can check and make sure that the fuel additive that you're considering is actually registered. But that is another point that's secondary to what we're talking about here. If it's claiming to do something, it has to contain an active ingredient that does that particular thing. And the problem is that we can't know for sure if it's got it in it short of asking the manufacturer. So what do? Do you just throw up your hands and say, well, it looks like I can't know what I can't know? Well, here's what I'll do if I'm trying to find this kind of information out, and I have had to try and find this information out before. There are times in the course of my duties as the technical information director when one of our staff will say, "Hey, we found this product. What can you tell us about it?" And now it's not very helpful for me to look on the bottle and say, well, it says this, 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 and this. Here you go. Because, well, they can read that for themselves. What I will typically try to do is I'll do some digging. And one of the things I'll try and get as good an idea as I can is, does it contain things that are likely to do what it's claiming to do? Now, how do I find that out? This is where you can look on the safety data sheet. Okay, those of us who deal with chemicals, we know what safety data sheets are, SDSs. The safety data sheet is first and foremost, it is a workplace safety document, right? It isn't actually designed to tell everybody everything that's in a formulation. What it is designed to do is it is designed to transmit or communicate information on hazards and dangers and what to do about those. So as such, it's a workplace safety document. But it does contain certain kinds of information that give us clues about what may be in a given product. So you take the safety data sheet and you start looking through it. Now, where are you going to find this kind of information? Used to be that safety data sheets were, let's say before, I don't know, 5-10 years ago, safety data sheets were kind of the wild, wild west. You could take a safety data sheet for a given product, and there's no telling what information you would find on it and what format it was in, because the format was not standardized. Well, I'm going to say about 5 years ago, I could be off a little bit on the timeline, but we'll say in the recent past, the United States formally adopted the Global Harmonization System, the GHS system. And the GHS system is the system that everybody else in the world uses to govern how this kind of information is organized and communicated. And as such, if you have an SDS that is within the last, say, 5 years, it's going to be a GHS formatted safety data sheet. And that means it's going to have a standard format. And you're going to have different sections in that SDS. And these different sections are designed to govern the transmission of certain kinds of information, right? There's information on what to do about firefighting measures. Section 14, which is usually located towards the back, is, if I remember right, it's the shipping information. It gives you the shipping classification and the packing group and UN number, hazard class, if that's applicable, things like that. Now, Section 3 is a section which I believe is usually called composition of ingredients. Now, what is this? Well, if you look in Section 3, and this, of course, assumes that the SDS is actually accurate and properly made, so to speak, that they didn't just leave off information. So assuming that, What you're going to find in section 3 of the SDS is you're going to find a list of certain ingredients that are in that that product, that formulation. It's going to tell you what's in it. Now, is it going to tell you everything that's in it? No, it will not. Is it going to tell you exactly the proportions of everything? No, it will not. And it probably shouldn't, because then basically you're telling people that if you're requiring them to have that on there, you're requiring them to basically just give everybody in the world their formulation. Here you go, have fun. But what it does have on it is the list of ingredients or constituents in that formulation that have hazard classes associated with them. And that is important to know. Now, how or why does this intersect with what we're trying to find out? And how do you know what to look for? Well, what you're going to be looking for in this section 3 is you're going to be looking for the names of certain things that are known within the industry to be the kinds of things that will do the function that it's claiming to do. So let's get a little bit more specific here. So let's say, for example, that you have a multifunction fuel additive, and one of the things that it claims to do is it claims to contain something that functions as a cetane improver. Cetane improver to raise the cetane number of the diesel fuel. That is something that is very worthwhile to have in a formulation. It's very beneficial for the end user. It's also something that is a function that's doesn't have a lot of things that will accomplish that. And there are there's only a handful of kinds of chemicals that are dominantly used within the industry to do that kind of thing. So if I'm looking at a formulation and I have the safety data sheet, and it's one of the things it says that it does, it makes a claim, raises fuel cetane rating by up to 6 points, whatever. I'm going to be going to section 3 of the SDS, and I'm going to be looking for something called 2-ethylhexyl nitrate, or some abbreviated 2-EHN. 2-ethylhexyl nitrate is a stock chemical. It has its own CAS number. And what I mean by that is it's a pure chemical. It's not something that is a proprietary mixture of other things. It would be like if you were looking for sulfuric acid, or if you were looking for ammonium nitrate. It's a base compound. But it is the most common, most popular, and the dominant cetane improving chemical that's used out in fuel additives. That is not a secret out there in the industry. It's not like I'm giving away trade secrets here. Everybody in the industry knows this. So if I'm looking in the SDS and I don't see 2-ethylhexyl nitrate, then unless they found some magic cetane improving chemical, which they might probably tell you, oh yeah, it's all secret, but really they probably didn't. So it's reason, if I don't see 2-ethylhexyl nitrate in section 3 of that SDS, then it is very reasonable for me to conclude that it's making a claim that it's probably not actually going to be able to accomplish. And for all of the main kinds of claims that are made for diesel fuel additives, I mean for gasoline too, but we'll stick to diesel for now. For all the major kinds of beneficial claims that are of functionality that are made for diesel fuel additives, there are certain kinds of chemicals that will do that. If it claims that anti-gel properties, then it's probably going to contain some kind of vinyl acetate. If it contains a detergent, it's going to contain one of a number of kinds, like a PBA detergent, something like that. Okay, now there's two things we might raise our hands here and say, yeah, but, because there's a couple of things we have to stop and we have to clarify here. The first thing I would clarify, or the first thing if I was in the audience and I wasn't the technical information director for a company that formulates fuel additives, I would raise my hands and say, how am I supposed to know what to look for? And that's a fair question because I've been in the industry for 15 years. I know what to look for. I know what to look for. But the hospital or the operations manager for the city of Sarasota bus fleet or whatever, he or she isn't going to know what to look for. And we know that it's not something that if you're not in the industry, you're probably not going to know what to look for. And that is a little bit of a hurdle. I'm just telling you that is one of the ways that you can start to tell if something is legitimate. Because a good fuel additive, remember, the question is, how can I tell a good fuel additive? How can I tell a good fuel additive from a bad one? That's the question that we're considering. And the first answer to that is, does it contain things that support it doing what it's claiming to do? Now, the other thing that we'd raise our hands is, someone looks on an SDS, they say, yeah, I tried that. And I looked on the SDS, I saw all this technical gobbledygook that I'm not familiar with. But I looked in this section 3, and all I saw was it just had like 3 lines on it, and they all said things like fully alkylated, processed hydrocarbons, blah, 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 blah. Okay. If I'm looking at that SDS and I see that kind of very generic listing, what that would tell me is, first of all, it would tell me it's not going to do something like provide detergency for injectors, provide an anti-gel functionality, provided lubricity functionality. There are chemicals for improving lubricity, raised cetane, certainly not going to have like a biocide function. Those kind of generic chemical names for essentially for hydrocarbons, what those basically are solvents. And so it's very likely if the section 3 listing is simply 3 or 4 listings of alkylated processed hydrocarbons, non-alkylated processed hydrocarbons, all it's really doing is saying, hey, I'm just a bunch of solvent. And of course that means it's probably not going to do what it's claiming to do. So that's the first thing I look for. And again, remember, I said this is somewhat more of an art than it is a science. You have to have a little bit of industry know-how, and that takes time to acquire. Or you could ask somebody who knows. I mean, heck, you could ask me if you wanted. I mean, I'm happy to help people in as much as I can. So the first thing, is it likely to contain things that mean it's going to do what it claims to do? Okay. Second thing that I look for, or that I would consider, is the reputation of the company. Now, yeah, this one is a little bit nebulous, but bear with me while I explain what I mean and why I bring this up. Okay, so this entire project, if you will, of predicting whether something will do what it says, predicting if something's actually a good fuel additive, because a good fuel additive is going to do what it says it does, and it's going to do it to the extent that it's claiming that it will do. So this entire project of trying to verify that, at its core, it is an exercise in speculation. I mean, we have to look for evidence. We have to take that evidence, apply our best knowledge to it to properly interpret it, and then we have to draw our best conclusions about what we think we know. So I bring up the reputation of the company because the reputation of the company matters because it can be used as a proxy for the legitimacy of the formulation. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, The concept of saying that is, if you have a company, a manufacturer, formulator, that's been in business for a long time, is established in the industry, and has a good reputation in the industry, then that kind of company is less likely to be ripping people off with bad products and snake oil than a company that just started and you've never heard of them. See, a company that's just starting out in this kind of industry, they are trying to gain a foothold in an industry that's extremely competitive. There are thousands of fuel additives out there. I won't say how many of them are actually good ones. We'll just say that there are some good fuel and legitimate fuel additives that are based on established, well, I should say, well established chemistries that are known in the industry. And then there are a lot of additives that are uh, really just not, well, we'll say nonsense, but they're, I almost said something else. They're really just additives that are just snake oil, for lack of a better way of putting it. So it's a very competitive additive landscape. And so the reputation of the company that is it matters, because if that company is just starting out, it's trying to gain a foothold in a competitive industry, it is looking for any thing possible, any way possible to get that foothold and to get a leg up on the competition, right? And the easiest way for them to do that is to exaggerate what they're going to do for you. And the easiest way for them to reduce their costs while claiming the most possible benefit is make the most number of claims, but don't actually put anything in their formulation. And yes, there are fuel treatments out there that actually do that because they rely on ignorance of the industry. They rely on people taking claims at face value. So a company that's been around for a long time, a company that has a good reputation in the industry, that's the kind of thing that you can't buy. The only way you can get that is to actually have been in business for a long period of time and to actually have made a lot of customers satisfied and happy. That I just said it, but I'll say it again. It's not something that you can buy. And so, again, this is a little bit nebulous. It's a little bit open to interpretation. And so you do have to take certain things with a grain of salt, right? If you're trying to do your due diligence in this matter. But point number two for how you can tell if something is actually going to be legitimate is it backed by a company that has a reputation for actually producing quality problem solving treatments. So that is number two. Third thing that I would look at, and this one that does relate somewhat to the first point. Remember when I said, how many things does it claim to do? And can you find evidence that it contains ingredients that support it doing what it's claiming? That was number one, if you remember. Number three, a relatively simple thing that you can look at, but simple but important, is you look at the treat rate relative to what it promises. So there's a lot that we can unpack to this. And like I said, yes, it does relate to the first one, but there's nuances about this one in particular that makes it worth calling out on its own. So I said a couple minutes ago that within the industry, there are chemistries, legitimate chemistries, that actually do do specific things. They were developed to do specific things, and they actually work. And people within the industry know which chemistries do this. For example, there are certain detergent chemistries for injectors, and there's a number of different classes of those detergents, but those are known within the industry. They're formulated to clean injectors out, and they do what they're supposed to do. I also said cetane improvers. There's 2-ethylhexyl nitrates, well known within the fuel industry as something that raises fuel cetane number. So it's a chemistry that does what it was created to do. So there are legitimate chemistries that have been developed to accomplish certain functions. But something we need to go a step further when we're considering that. And that is that, yes, you can have an ingredient in your formulation that does a certain thing. And if you have it in there, that means you can claim that your formulation contains something that does that. Go back to cetane improvers. I can take some 2-ethylhexyl nitrate, put it into a formulation, and then make a claim that my formulation contains cetane improver. Okay. However, it's not enough to simply be able to say, yeah, I've got cetane improver in my formulation. You have to have enough of it in there for your claimed effect to be reasonable to expect. So let's talk about cetane improvers. Raising fuel cetane number. The minimum requirement in the United States is 40 for diesel fuel. Many engine manufacturers prefer that you stick around, let's say, 45 or 46. I think the minimum in Japan is like 50. But if you've got a diesel fuel that's got, let's say, 42, and you want to raise it to a 45, you can put some 2-ethylhexyl nitrate into your fuel, but you have to there's a certain amount that you need to put in there in order for you to expect the cetane number of the fuel to go up by 3 or more points. Now, how does this relate to treat rate? Well, the treat rate governs how much of that chemical is getting into the fuel. And if you have a fuel additive that claims to do, let's say, 5 or 6 or 7 different things, that means it's going to have 5 or 6 or 7 or more different constituents that accomplish those functions. And not only does it have to have those in there, but it also has to have enough of those in there so that it will meet the expectations that are consistent with what you're claiming. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is, and this one I draw from experience because there are any number of fuel additives out on the market right now that make claims exactly like this. They talk about improving cetane number, okay, that's fine, but then they throw out a number that is high enough to pique the interest of the person that's considering it. So they say raises fuel cetane number by up to 8 points. Now, the first thing we might look at is, if you know anything about these things, you'd say, well, 8 points, that's a lot. And that means it's going to have a lot of cetane improver in there. So that's number one. The second thing, though, and this, I think if I explain this one, those of you in the audience may start to chuckle because you should be able to think of some examples of what I'm talking about. This idea of up to. So it says it's going to raise it up to 8 points. So what happens if you use that and it raises it by half a point? Well, it's up to 8 points. All that's really saying is you're not going to get more than 8 points. But we know, I mean, we laugh at that, but we know that that's not really what we're expecting, right? We're not expecting that, oh, I'm going to put this in here because I don't want more than 8 points. So I need something that raises it up to 8 points. Think about when you're at home, television commercials you see for diet products, right? Lose up to 30 pounds. They're up to 30 pounds in 30 days. Well, gee, I lost 6 ounces. Well, hey, you lost, that was up to 30 pounds, right? Okay, so I digress. So something is claiming to raise cetane by a substantial amount. That means it's going to have a substantial amount of cetane improver in its formulation. But if it says raises fuel cetane by 8 points and it has an outrageously low treat rate that is also designed to catch the eye of the consumer, like, oh, I don't know, 1 ounce to 50 gallons. Um, if it makes a claim like that, then what you have very likely got is a situation where even if the product does contain all the ingredients necessary to achieve all the, categorically achieve all the effects it's claiming, there's no way for it to contain enough of those things for it to do what you're expecting it to do. And what you're expecting it to do is what it's claiming to do. And that means that the company that put this formulation together and put together the product claims, they are being really deceptive. They are actually banking on the fact that they can claim that the product has an active ingredient in it that does a useful function, but they know, because they know the formulation, they know that it's not actually going to do what the purchaser assumes that it's going to. And that is a huge problem in the fuel additive industry. It's one of the reasons why people distrust fuel additives, because everybody's trying to claim that they're the best, because again, they're trying to set themselves apart from the competition. And the problem is that when you see something that is making a whole laundry list of claims, each one of those claims is the greatest thing you've ever heard, and then the last thing is, oh yeah, you only need to use this really, really, really low treat rate in order to accomplish all this. You can take a look at that and you can throw that to the side, because that product is not going to do what it's promising you. The only thing it's going to be really good at doing is taking your money and leaving you with sorrow and disappointment. So, in terms of a low treat rate, how low is too low? Again, if you're not in the industry, then these treat rates may not actually mean anything to you. Though that hospital administrator or that operations manager, they do not know if 1 ounce to 30 gallons is enough of a treat rate to do X, Y, or Z. They don't know if 1 ounce to 10 gallons is, or 1 ounce to 50. They don't know that. So the question, how low is too low? Well, again, it depends on what's being claimed, not only the number of things and the types of things that are being claimed, but also, if it goes this far, the level of benefit for each one. But speaking generally, if you've got a multifunction, then, and let's say it claims 1 ounce to 30 gallons. Well, depending on what's being claimed, 1 ounce to 30 gallons could be achievable. It would be more likely to be achievable if it was 1 ounce to 20 or 1 ounce to 10 gallons. A number of our formulations, multifunction formulations, use a base treat rate of 1 ounce to 10 gallons. 1 ounce to 10 gallons does give you enough what I call formula space to put enough active ingredients in there to do what we're claiming to do. If you go 1 ounce to 30 gallons, you're going to have much less formula space. And whether that formula space is enough really does depend on what's being claimed. So, what kinds of things that are usually claimed by fuel additives, what kinds of things depend most on treat rate? Okay, well, we already talked about one of them, cetane improvement. The amount of cetane improver that you need in a formulation depends on what your claim, how much of a rise in cetane number you're claiming it's going to do. Most for there to be a meaningful and noticeable rise in cetane number of that fuel, you're going to need at least 100 or 200 parts per million of what I call effective treat rate. 100 to 200 ppm. 200 ppm volumetrically is like 1 ounce to 5,000, or 1 to 5,000, excuse me, which is about 1 ounce to every 40 gallons. So that would mean if you had something that was 100% cetane improver and you had a listed treat rate on it of 1 ounce to 40 gallons, then it probably is going to be that's probably a legitimate claim. The problem is that it's very rare to find something that's just a cetane improver that makes that kind of claim at that low of a form of a treat rate. And if you're also trying to claim that there are other things in it besides that cetane improver and you're sticking to that treat rate, then now you're running into the area of not enough formula space to do everything that you want to do. So, cetane improvers, you need to have at least 100 to 200 ppm, and if claimed improvement is really high, like more than, let's say, 4 points, you're going to need maybe 400 or 500 parts per million. And when you start combining that with other claimed functions, that's when it starts to get dicey. So cetane improver can affect this. Another thing that can affect it is cold flow. Cold flow is another benefit, very important up north, and people up north know how much temperature drop, how much cold filter plug point or gelling temperature point, how much of a drop they need to have, depending on where they are. Categorically speaking, the larger the drop you're looking for, the more cold flow polymer, anti-gel polymer, vinyl acetate, if you want to get technical, the more of that you need in there. So same concept as with cetane improvers. If you've got a multifunction formulation and one of the things you've got in there is lowers fuel gelling point, but you claim some really, really high number, like let's say 40 degrees. Again, I'm speaking from experience. I've seen multifunction formulations, if you will, and one of the things that it claims, along with curing baldness and creating world peace and whatever, one of the things it claims is 40-point drop in cold filter plug point. Well, if you know anything about fuel chemistries, it's possible to get a 40-degree drop, but you need to use a lot of anti-gel polymer to achieve that. The problem is that this mystery formulation is claiming that, along with also claiming an 8-point rise in cetane improvement, and cleans the injectors, provides lubricity, does XYZ, everything else. And when you start putting all those together, there is no way that you can have a formulation that does all of those things at a treat rate of only, 1 ounce, even 1 ounce to 10 gallons. If you're talking about such a large drop in cold flow, you're going to be needing to use more than 1 ounce to 10 gallons of polymer just by itself with nothing else added. So cold flow is another one. There are certain claims that are common in the industry that do not require a lot of volume of active ingredient. Believe it or not, injector detergency is one of those things. What governs how much injector detergency you need to have in a formulation is how quickly do you want it to work. And in the industry, there are what they call keep clean treat rates, and there are cleanup treat rates. Cleanup is exactly what you think it is. You run an injector cleaner through or detergent package through a dirty injector, and over a period of time, it will clean all of that out and make it clean. Keep clean is basically you can run it through a clean injector and it will keep it clean for as long as it's running through it. Each one of those, depending on the detergent chemistry that you have, each one of those has a minimum amount of detergent that needs to be delivered in there in order for that to happen. And for a cleanup, you the amount that you need to have in there also depends on how quickly you want it to happen. Whether you want it to happen and that's usually governed by number of hours of driving, right? There's a volume treat rate that says it will clean injectors in 16 hours of driving or 10 hours of driving. And so depending on if you want it to be cleaned up in, let's say, 3 tanks of fuel, which usually is what 16 hours corresponds to, or 2 tanks of fuel, which is typically around 7 hours, or 1 tank of fuel, which is closer to, let's say, 4 hours of driving, or even 1 hour cleanup. There are treat rates, detergent treat rates, that correspond to all of those. And they're not huge amounts. So you can have, if you're not needing to have like a 1 hour cleanup of an injector, then you really don't need that much. You don't need 1,000 parts per million of detergent. You can get away with 50 or 100 parts per million. But again, when you start stacking that in a formulation with cold flow and cetane improver, lubricity improver, you don't tend to need to use a lot of those, but let's say you do have that in there. You may only need, let's say, 20 or 30 parts per million of that. But it all adds up. If you need 100 ppm of this and 30 ppm of this, and you need 200 ppm of this and another 200 ppm of another this, and when you add it all up, you start to realize that trying to do all that and claiming to be able to do it at some really, really low treat rate, like 1 to 5,000 or something, there's not enough formula space for that to work. Okay, last thing that we're going to talk about on this third and final point for how can you tell if a fuel additive is legit or not. Let's talk about biocidal claims. Okay, so this doesn't have anything to do with treat rate. So maybe this is point number 4. This relates to a specific thing. Okay, so we've talked about the certain kinds of things, like certain kinds of benefits that are claimed by multifunction fuel additives out there, right? We've talked about detergency. We talk about, some claim to control water, raise cetane, help with cold flow, help with lubricity, couple of other things. Stability, fuel stability is another thing. Anti-corrosion protection is another thing. But one of the things that you'll find in some of them has to do with microbes. So you may see a formulation that makes a claim, it has this list of things it'll do, and then it also makes a claim that reads something like either kills microbes or controls microbes or prevents microbial growth. From the EPA's standpoint, and the EPA Division or Office of Pesticides is the government entity that actually governs the regulations on biocide fuel treatments. From their standpoint, all three of those claims are categorically the same. They are what they call biocidal claims. They infer that it's going to kill microbes. And that matters to the EPA because if you are making what they deem to be a biocidal claim, if you infer that your fuel additive is going to kill or control microbial growth, then by law, you are required to register it as a biocide. You would register its formulation with the Office of Pesticides. Usually they'll require you to submit a whole slew of test information and safety information that corresponds to that, which is why a lot of people don't like to do it. And there are a number of biocide chemistries, legitimate biocide chemistries out there, something we can't go into today. But the thing about making biocidal claims is if you have a fuel additive, it's a multifunction treatment, and one of the things it claims strongly infers that it's going to do that kind of thing for you. It's going to control microbial growth. Then it's pretty important for you to correctly assess if it's actually going to do that. So how can you tell if it's going to do that? Luckily, there is something that you can do on this point that will give you the answer on this. That is, you're going to look on the label for what's called an EPA for two things. You're going to look for an EPA registration number and an EPA establishment number. Now, I'm looking here. Okay, this is a bottle of biocide. Now, for those of you on the video, you can see the bottle that I'm holding up. For those of you listening by audio, I'll have to describe what we see. So, this is a legal label for a biocide. This one is one of our formulations, Clear Kill. It's an MBO industrial microbicide, MBO chemistry. And one of the things that all legally registered biocides are required to have on them is those two registration numbers. And if you can look and see, there are two numbers right on the front. One says EPA establishment number, and then the other one says EPA registration number. Both of those are supposed to correspond to specific things. The EPA registration number is the base registration number for the chemistry itself. And then the establishment number is actually a registration number for the place that packaged it, which means you can only package these, bottle these, if you will, at places that are approved to do so, because biocides are essentially pesticides. So you need to have a place that has all the safety measures in place and has knows what to do, knows how to how to dot all the I's and cross all the T's, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, so we bring this up because if one of these fuel additives that you've never heard of makes a specific claim that relates to controlling microbial growth, and they do not have those two numbers easily found on their labels, then you can, with almost 100% certainty, you can conclude that it doesn't actually contain anything that controls microbial growth. And if I was a person in a decision-making position, and I saw that, there is no way that I would ever entertain using something like that, because those people fall under one of two possibilities to get to the position they're in, where they have put a bottle in your hand that's making that kind of claim, but doesn't have that evidence to back it up. They either didn't know that you had to have that on there, which means they don't know what they're doing. And do you want to trust, your situation to somebody like that? I wouldn't. The other thing is they know what they have to do, but they're just not going to do it. In which case, I would never do business with a company like that either, because I couldn't trust them. So, a biocidal claim, this whole thing about biocide claims, actually makes the answer a lot easier, because it's much more black and white about knowing if it contains the right kind of chemistry to actually kill microbes and support what it's claiming. If you see that evidence on the label, the 2 registration numbers, if you see those, then it's very likely that it at least does have that. That doesn't necessarily mean it has everything else in it, but at least it does have that, and that's a good thing. If it's making those kind of microbial control claims and it does not have those on there, then I don't see how there's any way that you could trust that it does anything that it's claiming to do, because they intentionally are misleading you on that very important claim. And so that, my friends, is really the kind of the synopsis of the things that I would look for in how to judge a good fuel additive. So to summarize what we have laid out over the last 56 minutes, you look for what kinds of things does it promise. The more it promises to do, the less likely that it can deliver on all those promises. And if you can't find evidence in the SDS that it contains things that will do what it's actually claiming to do, then there's a good chance that it doesn't actually contain that, and it's overselling itself. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is reputation of the company. If the company has been around a long time and has a good reputation within the industry for making quality products, well, that kind of thing only comes through actually having good products and actually making customers happy time after time after time over a long period of time, and that has tangible value. And then the third one, the treat rate relative to what it promises. If the treat rate seems unusually low relative to the 17 things it's claiming to do, and oh yeah, one of the things is it claims to kill microbes, but it doesn't have a EPA registration and EPA establishment number, you can throw that in the trash or wherever else. Set it aside, because you do not want to waste your time and money on something like that. And so that about wraps things up for today's episode of the Fuel Pulse Show. Thanks again. Thank you for spending part of your day with us. Check out the show notes at our website for links to everything that was mentioned in this episode. Those are located at www.bellperformance.com. Please make sure, as always, to subscribe to this podcast in iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you get your podcasts. Last but not least, if you liked what you heard and you haven't done so already, please feel free to leave us a review of this podcast at your preferred site. Reviews are really important, one of the most important ways that will help people find us. So, that being said, I'm Eric Bjornstad. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll catch you next time at the Fuel Pulse Show.